Okay, I think let's get started. So welcome everyone. I'm Chris Thoung. I'm Chief Economist of Cambridge Econometrics, and I'll be chairing the session today. And here also on the screen, you see my colleague Ha Bui, who's our speaker today, and also our Head of Global Climate Policy. For those not familiar with us, Cambridge Econometrics is an independent economics consultancy. We spun out of the University of Cambridge 40 years ago this year, as it happens, and the company's original purpose was to build on academic work to construct computer models of the economy. So modeling is in our DNA, and I'm really pleased that we're running this webinar today on the role of economic modeling in understanding the green transition and net zero. So if we can maybe just quickly move over to the slide that gives the agenda for today. This is really what we'll be taking you through today, or should I say Ha will be talking you through today. We'll first set the scene. We'll explain why the transition to net zero is a complex phenomenon and problem to understand, and we'll talk about the role of scenario modeling, the role of models, different types of models in that, with some examples using our own macroeconometric model E3ME, and then we'll hopefully leave you with some useful takeaways so you can bear those kinds of things in mind should you ever need to call on modeling work in the future. We do have time for questions at the end, and you should be able to find the questions box in the web browser. So please, as we're going through, feel free to type your thoughts, any questions through, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can with the time that we have at the end. So I think that will be all from me just for now, and over to you, Ha.
Thanks, Grace, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. So we're all here because we're interested in understanding the complexity of the transition, and we're concerned about the uncertainties that comes with it. But quite likely, we would also have different definitions of what these concepts mean. So instead of picking a single definition to use throughout, we thought it'd be helpful to actually start with some policy questions related to the transitions that we have come across in our work. So, for example, our clients and collaborators are very interested in understanding if decarbonisation is good for the economy, how much it may cost, and what are the potential opportunities and trade-off of following one path compared to another, and whether it would affect their decisions differently if they are located in a certain industry or a certain part of the world, for example. Just based on this list of questions, which is just scratching the surface, the complexity of the transition, in our view, comes from not only the different angles that you can look at it, judging by these questions that we have here, but also what we don't see here, which is the different drivers and interactions underneath, which means you may not have just one answer to each of these questions, or you could have an answer that is very hidden away. So now let's take one of these questions as an example and go deeper into why we do economic modeling and how economic modeling helps us get to that answer to the question that we're interested in. If we think about, for example, how the transition would impact employment or jobs, at first glance, there are a number of logical relationships that we can identify, as we can see here. So economic growth may foster new employment opportunities. Innovation would impact the use of technologies, which then in turn replace certain jobs with others. At the same time, industrial structure would influence which country or region may have demand for certain types of jobs, and on the other hand, skills would determine which of the jobs and where can readily be filled. And finally, trade and political economy often also influence how these jobs may move around. Overall, it's reasonably clear to follow and understand, unless there's more to the eye. So what if we also think about the drivers of the drivers. What if the drivers also interact with each other? Then how do we know which one comes first? What about things that we don't see as obvious, such as the role of nature, the role of the informal economy, and how the impacts of the transition may change over time, which will have intergenerational implications? Now, as we start zooming into some of these details, the original question that we had at the beginning, which seemingly was quite simple, quickly become very complicated. And at this point, the problem is too complex for anyone most likely to just sit down and work out an answer. Now, what do we do? Maybe a model can help. So with that, let's explore how modeling features in this kind of policy analysis and the different types of models that you may come across. As modelers, we really like this quote by George Box, who was a British statistician who were attributed to highlighting the limitation of statistical models in the 20th century, but we still find it very relevant to this day. Basically, he argues that models are simplification of reality because it's not possible for us to carry out macroeconomic experiments in real life, but because they are a simplification of reality, models cannot anticipate uncertainties, especially the types that are not known. And importantly, there are different kinds of models for different kinds of questions. So now let's come back to our net zero job question from earlier. Why is it important to understand the different types of models? First of all, because we determine that this issue is very complex, quite often because of data and analytical power and computing power, there is no single model that can cover all of these aspects and answer all of the underlying questions related to them. And really, this was the foundation for different model families to emerge. We'll be talking about 4 types of models that are often used in studies related to climate change and energy transition. They are climate models, energy system model, integrated assessment models, and energy economy environment models. First of all, climate models are founded in climate sciences, and they tend to see the Earth system as a whole. So basically taking a bird's eye view of the atmosphere and often used for determining the optimal pathway of staying within a certain long-term outcome, for example, a certain global temperature target. So it's really a planning tool, and it is quite high level in the sense you can see compared to the original problem that we were looking at. Here we're introducing some dashed lines, as you can see, to signal that a relationship is represented to some extent in each of the model type, either by proxy, scenario interventions, or by linking with other types of models. And this is different from the solid lines, which signal that a relationship is fully represented within the model. Energy system models are similar to climate models in the way that they usually also look at cost minimizing ways of delivering a long-term target. The difference in terms of energy system models is that they are founded in engineering disciplines and therefore often cover very specific sectors, but at the same time going into quite a lot of details within that given sector, either on the technology dimension or the time dimension, for example, going into daily or hourly frequency, which make them suitable for planning purposes and also in some cases for a much shorter term operational analysis. One thing that we notice is different in this diagram compared to the previous one is this one-way logical chain between the economy and the energy system. In other words, there is some representation of the economy in energy system models, but quite often is taken as a given assumption. So now we'll continue expanding further in scope and look at integrated assessment models, which are also based on a top-down optimal kind of approach as the previous models. Instead of looking at the atmosphere as climate models do, integrated assessment models tend to focus on the economy and specifically the two-way interactions between the economy and climate. Some integrated assessment models also have a sectoral dimension, although they tend to be relatively high level and limited. So this is a type of economic models that is often used in analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Finally, another type of economic model or macroeconomic models is energy economy environment models, or as we often refer to, E3 models. These models are models that cover the whole economy, and they often include also detailed sectors and sometimes detailed technologies. The difference between E3 models and all of the previous model types that we talk about is in terms of how it connects all of the three E's within the E3 system, which in the other types generally are only looked at by pairs or in isolation. It's worth noting that within each group of models, including E3 models, there are different variations within the same family as well. So under the E3 family, there are models which are optimization models. They are designed to look for the least cost way of delivering a long-term outcome or finding a way to return to a long-run equilibrium position after a temporary shock. Whereas there are other models which are simulation tools. They do not assume equilibrium conditions or cost minimizing behaviors. The models that we develop and maintain at Cambridge Econometrics, including our EFME models, are examples of the simulations model. So the name EFME is very descriptive in terms of the types of model that it is. The E3 stands for the E3 elements here, and the ME stands for macroeconometrics, which means that the model covers the whole economy and its behaviors are driven by parameters that are derived from historical data. But over the years, E3ME has been developed further to account for the potential non-linearities, as we may call it, or complexity of low-carbon technology diffusion in certain sectors that are very high emitting and therefore need to decarbonize rapidly, because this diffusion pathway tends to follow an S-curve based on historical evidence rather than a linear relationship over time. So this is in recognizing and addressing some limitations of using historical data to project very far into the future. In this case, EFME currently solves annually to 2070, so that's almost 50 years away. It's worth noting that E3 models like EFME are the most advanced and powerful, but also the most complex amongst all the types that we'll talk about. And as modelers, there is often a design choice trade-off between trying to cover more domains and relationships and covering more details within a given domain. For example, climate models can go into tracking climatic conditions on an hourly basis. And on the other hand, E3 models, because of their broad coverage, they tend to require quite standardized classifications that are restricted to group of sectors and annual resolution rather than daily. And this is mainly a technical and model design consideration. In a similar vein, an integrated assessment model would be very appropriate if we want to explore questions related to the optimal pathway of achieving a temperature target, but perhaps less so if we want to understand how very specific sector policies may act as enablers or barriers to the transition. And importantly, all of these model types are used to often explore possible futures, and they are not forecasting tools. So a good modeling analysis often start with something quite fundamental, which is to pick the right model to the right question and understanding how that model selection affects the results that may come out later on. Now that we establish a baseline understanding of the different model types and the foundation for a good modeling study, we'll dig deeper into what modeling actually entails based on our experience and what it can tell us about the job question that we had earlier. A modeling often involves many steps, and within each step there are also sub-steps. It often starts with defining the research question. What are we interested in understanding, and what is the policy problem that we're grappling with? And then selecting the appropriate framework or tool to help us analyze those questions. Most of the work that we do as economic modelers is in defining, analyzing, and interpreting the scenarios with or on behalf of our clients and collaborators. And the interpretation stage is often the most important, but also the most time-consuming and challenging, not just because it comes at the end and we need to produce final outcomes of what is often a fairly complex analysis, but also because to understand the results often requires a certain level of understanding of the inner mechanisms and inner workings of the models that give rise to those results. So for the rest of the next session, we'll talk through a scenario application and see how models can help us find some answers to what may be quite complex problems. And we'll do that by using some examples from E3ME applications in our work. And to remind you, E3ME is a global macroeconomic model with sectoral disaggregation. It is centered around the system of national accounts and bilateral trade relationships. The model behaviors cover the E3 domains and driven by a combination of econometric parameters, technology diffusion, and scenario-specific policy levers. And because there is because scenario-specific policy levers are an important input to the model, E3ME is often used as a scenario tool by running or simulating a number of scenarios and then often comparing those scenarios with a given baseline or with each other. So that's what we will do. Let's take a hypothetical scenario, which we call well below 2 degree scenario here, which involves meeting the Paris Agreement climate target by rapid and immediate mitigation action across all countries. Here we're assuming that all countries will implement some mix of policies that help decarbonize the whole economy, including carbon pricing, energy efficiency, subsidies for low carbon technologies, bans on fossil fuels, a biofuel mandate, and lastly, revenue recycling, which essentially involves using some of the carbon revenues from the carbon pricing to fund policy implementation for the transition, and any shortfall or surplus after that get redistributed through tax adjustments so that government's fiscal positions are unaffected. With that in mind, as we may expect, the policy that we implemented for fossil fuel phasing out and low carbon technology subsidies and carbon pricing are expected to lead to a visible change in the mix of final energy consumption at the global level by 2050. So if we start looking at these pie charts here, we can see an increase in the share of electricity in the mix, as well as for other low carbon fuels, such as hydrogen and biofuels. Within the electricity generation, for each gigawatt of electricity, we also expect to see a shift in the resources that are used for that generation. So what's most obvious here by comparing these two charts are we see an increasing share of solar, wind, and biomass to replace what had historically been coal and oil and gas. This is reflected also in the employment results, which is something that we were interested in our hypothetical policy question. First of all, we can see by comparing the employment in specific sectors in the scenario to the baseline level, there is a reduction in all of the fossil fuel sectors compared to the baseline. And at the opposite end, there is an increase in employment in the electricity sector. There is a substitution effect here, which aligns with the change in demand at the global level that we saw previously. Something that is also worth noting here is we will see that the increase in electricity jobs is smaller than the combined reduction in jobs in the fossil fuel sectors, and this basically implies that for each jobs in existence in the low carbon economy, that job corresponds to a lower average level of energy consumption, which we can correspond to this more rapidly declining energy intensity of the overall economy. So overall, the logic in terms of jobs being related to change in energy demand is quite straightforward and easy to understand if there is a clear logical link between them. Now, if we look at electricity sector jobs more closely and also looking across region, we can see that first of all it's not uniformly distributed, but also there is a pattern where the regions are likely to see the largest absolute increase in jobs by 2050 are those that have quite large workforce and also high renewable potentials. For example, countries in Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. What we don't see here is this increase in jobs is not only related to the change in energy demand, but also often is related to a change in labor intensity of energy production. And what I mean by that is, for example, renewable electricity tends to be more labor intensive than conventional fossil fuel based electricity generation. So that is also something that's at play. And Now we have two drivers of the results, so it's getting a little bit more complex than it was before, but it's still manageable. If we start putting the fossil fuel jobs results and electricity jobs results together, and bearing in mind they were moving in different directions, what we end up with is something that is similar to this blue line on this chart, which shows the impacts on total employment in the scenario in relative terms compared to the baseline. What's happening here is a positive increase in total employment in the short and medium term, which is generally supported by an increase in investment, which is needed to roll out new low carbon technology. And that is followed by a negative impact in the longer term as the economic activities and mainly trade and investment that are related to fossil fuels are phasing out in the longer term. And we see that also this is reflected in the GDP results, which follow the trend for the impact on employment, but to a greater degree with the gap representing the productivity effect, because when we see an increase or a reduction in economic activity, it is not just labor or employment that gets affected, but also other inputs to production such as capital. It is worth noting that a negative impact doesn't necessarily mean a decline overall. And to demonstrate that, if we look at this chart here, this is the same information on employment at the global level for the two scenarios, but in terms of absolute number of jobs instead of relative differences between scenarios. And we can see that in both scenario employment is growing, but it may grow slightly slower in the scenario that we're looking at here compared to the baseline. Right. Quite often, so we talk a lot about the headline figures, but quite often in our work as modelers and also consultants, we need to go beyond the headline figures and look at a way to tell a story or derive policy implications from what is often lots and lots of numbers, which requires looking at indicators that are less obvious. So I'll give you an example by talking about a case where these less obvious indicators really make a difference, and it's quite important in understanding the results. And that example is by looking at the relationship between employment and household consumption. So intuitively, we would think that these indicators have a relatively linear relationship in the way that if we have more jobs, we likely would have more income that can lead to an increase in consumption. But what we see here in terms of what the model tells us is it's not quite linear in the way that the two lines for the two indicators, which represent their impacts in the scenario compared to the baseline, are not tracking each other exactly, which can be a seemingly strange behavior to observe. So to disentangle this requires looking at the underlying relationships that lead to this outcome. And we'll do that by walking through a few pairs of indicators. The first one I want to talk about is employment and pre-tax income. They do follow each other relatively closely, and this matches our hypothesis that if there's more employment, there will be more income. If we move on to looking at pre-tax income and post-tax incomes, they still mimic each other somewhat, but there is a larger gap compared to what we were looking at in terms of employment and pre-tax incomes. This gap between the two lines basically represents the average tax burden. And the reason why post-tax incomes is projected by the model to have a larger relative impact than pre-tax income is because of the revenue recycling assumption that we talked about earlier. which implies here that some of the carbon revenues are in surplus and get redistributed by a reduction in tax. On the other hand, if we compare post-tax income and real income, which is where we have accounted for the effect of inflation, we see that much of that positive impact on pre-tax incomes become very small, and initially the gap is quite large, and this basically reflects the inflationary effect of the introduction of carbon pricing, which may get passed on to consumers through higher prices, as well as the cost of moving towards a low carbon technology mix, where some of the technologies might not be at cost parity yet compared to fossil fuel based technologies. But as we can see, this gap closes over time, and this reflects the benefits from deploying more low carbon technologies, which then bring their costs down through learning by doing, as well as the reduced exposure to carbon pricing over time as emissions come down. And finally, now connecting this change in real income back to real consumption, there is some of the effect on real income is also reflected in the impacts on real consumption. The difference here basically signal the role of savings and borrowing and how they act as different sources of financing to support household expenditure. So overall, that's the story behind what we start off with as quite a strange effect, but essentially it comes down to the way that carbon revenues are recycled, which is a scenario design element, and also the model's allowance, or rather the role of inflation and different sources of financing in the model, which is more related to model logic. Now let's turn to a different dimension and look at how jobs are distributed across different regions. We pick manufacturing here as an example because in our work, manufacturing is an important sector in a low carbon economy and quite often are projected to see positive impacts from the transition. But we can see from the chart that benefit is not distributed evenly across different parts of the world. And in this scenario setting, the model projects that most of the benefit will accrue to emerging and developing economies, which currently have comparative advantage in producing and exporting manufactured goods, whereas under current trade patterns, there would be little to gain in terms of manufacturing jobs for developed economies. It is also in a similar fashion that historical development status and current trade patterns are a very strong driver of structural shifts within different economies. So what we can see from the results is that for developed economies such as the EU, there is quite little change in the sexual composition over time compared to developing economies like ASEAN countries, for example. But that's not to say that there is no shifts happening, but rather some of the shifts or some of the most obvious shifts may be happening within sectors because of the technology developments in this transition. And one example that demonstrates that quite clearly is in the power sector, where if we look at a breakdown of jobs in the electricity sector, but by the different types of technology that they support, in a developed market like the EU, there is a trend in the results where there is a diversification in the mix with renewables are not wind and solar coming more strongly into the mix over the time frame that we're looking at here, whereas in a developing market like ASEAN countries, it's more about scaling up technologies that are already proven, such as wind and solar, with other renewables only coming in more strongly towards the end. All right. So we talk a lot about structural shifts and sectoral implications. It's helpful to take a step back and think about this scenario as one that is very focused on mitigation action, but we recognize that the transition is not just about energy, and there is a role for the intersection of different policy domains to have an influence on the results. And an example of that is if there was an acceleration of industrial strategy in some of the regions, for example, then that may actually accelerate or revert some of the trends that we've seen in the last few slides. So here, having a tool that can look at different scenarios and sensitivities, such as Ishiyami, is powerful because we can then look at how these different policy factors may interact and influence each other. So we've looked at a lot of results, and we can see some of the conclusions emerging from them. I will do a quick recap, but it's helpful to remind ourselves that the conclusions that the models give us are usually one conclusion that is true under certain conditions. It's not the conclusion that will always be true. And that is something that is often misunderstood about the use of models, perhaps. An example is we've seen that the model projects an increase in employment in the electricity sector, but if there was very restricted mobility or severe skills shortages in certain parts of the world, then that pace of increase in employment may actually turn out to be slower than what the model had projected. And similarly, we've seen that there are aggregate short-term positive impacts on GDP and employment because of the investment stimulus, but that is based on the condition that we're able to draw on spare capacity and financing that are there to start with. If we were in a position where everyone is employed, for example, then by making additional investment and creating additional economic activity and demand may imply diverting resources away from other sources, and leading to inefficiencies such as crowding out. So I will wrap up. With that in mind, we think that economic modeling is a very powerful tool to support decision making, but it can also sometimes be as much of an art as it is a science. And as modelers, as we continue to invest in the capability to model more complex relationships and hidden uncertainties that might not already be captured, we recognize that models have limitations, and there's tremendous value in bridging the gap between modelers and users of model results. And because of that, we would like to close this with a number of questions that may motivate you in understanding and judging models and model results to help inform your decisions at every stage of the modeling process, as you may engage with. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ha. That's great. And well, as you see here, really the challenges really stem from that first part, which is the transition. The real world is complicated, and has hopefully become a little bit clearer, the role of models and modelers is to engage in a process of, should we say, deliberate simplification to create a tool with which you can understand alternative scenarios. So the last parts that Har was really picking up on are important because it relates to the kinds of statements that modeling work supports. So it's often the case that you'll hear X leads to Y, but beneath that is very much this idea that X leads to Y, depending on the kinds of conditions in the model that R was talking about, but also what is and isn't represented in the model as well, and being able to ask at times either intelligent or quite probing questions about what's in or out of the model is important as a policymaker, just to understand what you're looking at, I suppose. Uh, we have had various questions coming in, and what I'm going to do is do my best to try and synthesize some of those questions to cover a few bases at the time. But I would say that the general theme of some of these questions splits very much into, should we say, technical questions about what models are and what they can and can't do. But also there's a little bit of a strand that's coming through in terms of what is the role of models in the policy process. So what are the models being used for, and how do people engage with them? And maybe Hara could just pose one of those to you first on just the policy side, which is, in the policy process, the modeler has to work with policymakers and other stakeholders. So how does that work over the course of a modeling study, and how do those results end up finding their way into a policy?
Thanks. I would say that it can vary a lot between different groups of policymakers and stakeholders, but it's generally depending on the appetite of the stakeholders in engaging with the modeling process. Um, I actually quite enjoy it when we have policymakers who are very enthusiastic and ask a lot of questions and would like to get into the details of the modeling, especially the part that matters, like we were talking about in terms of understanding what's going on and what explains the results. Um, I, I think, well, we've done a lot of work with the European Commission, for example, and they are a very good example of a group of policymakers that are very engaged with the process, and they are involved in setting out the policy research questions. They also engage in how we structure and design the scenarios to answer those questions. And they really have um, an appetite to understand at a deep level what's driving the results, because ultimately they are going to take the results to communicate with other policymakers and their own stakeholders, and it's quite helpful and important to have an understanding of what has been done in the modeling study. And the work that we've done with them, as an example, is um, in using EGME alongside other equilibrium or optimization economic models to assess the economic impact of the EU climate targets. Um, it is the results are featured in the impact assessment, which is publicly available, and also discussed behind the scenes and in discussions with the different member states government. So that's just one example of how the results have featured in policy discussions.
Great, thank you. A really good follow-up came in while you were speaking as well, which is really the concern about models as black boxes when it requires often very technical staff to be able to operate and make sense of those results. So, in those sorts of cases, what's been your experience of how either outcomes are accepted, understood, or how are consumers of these models educated to make those insights land? And I should also be clear. There's an addendum here. Even if the outcome is not in the interest of the policymaker.
That's a very interesting question. And I would say again, our experience varies a lot. Um, there is a degree of, in our work, there is always a degree of bringing the policymakers on board with the role that the model or models are playing within a certain analysis, and helping them see what the models cover, what the models, more importantly, don't cover, and why or why not that matters for the results. Um,
Okay, that's
um,
fine. Go
yeah,
on.
I think, yeah, in terms of the bit about models being black box, um, that is very valid, and it is something that I think we're always trying to overcome as modelers. There is a balance between um, developing a tool that is very powerful and versatile that can do many different things, and also keeping it or making it accessible, and understandable to people who are not experts. And that is what I find to have the most value and what gives me the most enjoyment, I suppose, in doing our projects where we talk through some of those underlying details, with the users of the model results. And the users also are people that belong to different groups, as well, with different interests, including not just policymakers, but also, for example, private sector stakeholders and academic partners who would have various degrees of interest and understanding. Um, and for example, we would have projects that go through the model code with some of our academic collaborators. um, Not everyone would have the appetite to go into that level of detail, but it is can sometimes be quite interesting to do that, and in a way also help us see where the models and the modeling approach could be improved on.
Yeah, and certainly our long-standing experience is bringing the policymakers on that journey is really important as well. You know, it doesn't work if you bring those results to them right at the end. They need to be part of the process that develops and understands the scenarios. And I think, as you mentioned before, Hart, in some of the really big questions, because different models simplify in different ways, it's not uncommon to use different models to really just see, would we get a different result if we made alternative assumptions, and that's all part of the evidence that policymakers need. Um, if I can maybe just change tack a little bit, then maybe we can dig a little bit more into some of those, should we say, slightly more technical details. And you've talked before about these different types of models. So we had the E3 models, of which you showed some results, but also IAMS and energy system models and climate models. But of course, there's diversity within each of those segments, and maybe you could just say a little bit more about what are the considerations, the pros and cons of, say, a model like ours, E3ME, compared to others.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we could write a whole essay about comparing the different types of model in detail, but if I have to synthesize it, I think the main advantages of using a tool like eFME compared to some of these other model families that we talk about, um, are, well, first of all, the comprehensive coverage of the different domains, but at the same time, not fully compromising or removing all the details underneath that are often very important in helping us understanding the storyline. And because of that balance, um, not quite leaning onto one or the other, it makes the models powerful and flexible to answer many different types of questions from different domains. The second advantage, I think, is in another balancing act, but um, this time in terms of balancing the the use of economic foundations and theory and use of um, empirical evidence in a model of this scale and complexity. Um, so um, so with this balance, it is also able to look at a wider range of possibilities, which is very important, and I think is something that is sometimes overlooked when there is uncertainty and there are barriers that are not necessarily um, market related or quantifiable, which prevent us from adopting a certain strategy that we think is maybe best or will be least costly. Um, some models are not designed to capture those factors or issues. And I mean, if you and me is not designed to capture all of those either, because sometimes there are uncertainties that no one knows about. Um, but that is something that I think is quite impressive in terms of what it can do or how far we can push it. Obviously, there is a limitation in terms of to have a powerful and robust modeling tool. The quality of the data is very important and is something that um, we spend a lot of time on, especially for emerging and developing, or I mean, just generally smaller industry and smaller countries with little or limited data. It can sometimes be a challenge to find ways to standardize the data across the board and fill in gaps, um, which is important for what is essentially an empirical model that is based on a lot of data. Um, but I find that the value from our analysis and work is in exactly bringing that standardized data set and what is just a starting point of the analysis, and then tailor it to a specific country or region context to make sure it's relevant for the policymakers that are in that geography, rather than having sort of like a box mix that may be the same across all geographies.
Great, thank you. We're sort of running up against time, so we won't have too many other questions. One of the others that came through is, are there certain policies or conditions that are easier to model than others?
There always is. Uh, um, I mean, I think because the modeling that we do with ETME, for example, generally it takes a very bottom-up approach where we would be looking at policy levers that are very specific to a region or a sector or even a technology for some sectors. Um, it can be difficult in the policy context if we need to model an overarching target that may be only formed at the economy-wide level, for example. Um, or rather, it's not impossible to do it, but it's just more time intensive, and there is a higher degree of uncertainty in translating that type of assumption into something that the model will understand. Um, Something else that um, is a little bit of a challenge as well, but not in terms of the model operation, but rather in terms of how we design scenarios is how to distinguish between something that is embedded in the data from historical years um, with something that is new to the system. And what I mean by that is because the the baseline of the model is often based on some trends that have happened in the past to a certain degree. Um, in implementing a scenario that is in addition or on top of that baseline, we need to make sure that we're not double counting what's already there. And the best example I can think of that at the moment is in terms of automation, for example. Automation has been happening for many years, and if we continue on the current trend, um, which would be embedded in the baseline, we would still get some degree of automation in the future. But what the baseline won't account for, and that would motivate the use of a scenario, is if we assume there is a breakthrough in AI, for example, which is beyond what has happened historically. So yeah, those are some of the challenges that we come across as modelers.
That's great. Thank you very much. Given where we are, I think I will have to stop the questions at that point, though there are certainly more to go. We've covered a lot of ground today, and as you can all probably imagine, this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're doing here at Cambridge Econometrics. I'd really like to thank you all for your attendance today and your various questions. I'm afraid, and I can see quite a few, we didn't quite get to them all, but of course we'd be happy to follow up even on an individual basis as needed. Thanks also to Ha for the presentation and discussion today. And I don't know, Ha, if you have any parting comments or thoughts for the audience.
Yeah, likewise, as Chris said, thanks very much for attending and listening to our webinar. I would put our I would invite you to get in touch with us with further questions and things that you're curious about, or things that you're interested in terms of the role model that we didn't get to today. And contacts are on the slides, and yeah, we'll look forward to having further discussions.
Great. Thank you very much. This webinar has been recorded today, so you should receive a link to the video in the not too distant future should you want to revisit anything that we've covered today. And otherwise, as Pa says, and as you see on the screen, if there's anything else you'd like to discuss or ask, you should definitely feel free to get in touch as well. So thanks once again for your time today. I hope I hope you enjoyed it and that it was insightful and useful to you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.